Okay, so welcome to part 2 of the chapter 3 lecture. We left off by talking about the different ways in which we come to know ourselves, or rather, talking about the different sources of the self-concept. So we were talking about self-perception theory, which says that when we are unsure about a situation, or when a situation is ambiguous, we will often look at our own behavior in order to determine how we feel or what we think about ourselves or the person we're interacting with or the situation that we find ourselves in. Another source for the self-concept is the influence of other people. So according to social comparison theory, we often describe ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. And there's essentially two ways in which we compare ourselves to others. We can do an upward social comparison or a downward social comparison. So an upward social comparison is when we are going to find people who, let's say, are in a similar situation to us, but who are more experienced or who are handling the situation in a lot better way than we are. And we might look to those people and compare ourselves to them. That will typically result in a reduction of self-esteem, because we are going to realize that we are not as good as these people. We could also do a downward social comparison. So a downward social comparison is to essentially, again, try to find somebody or a group of people who are in a similar situation than we are, but who are not as experienced, as privileged, as well off, whatever the case may be. They are not exceeding as well as we are, let's say. And through downward social comparison, we can actually give ourselves a little self-esteem boost, because in this situation, we're comparing ourselves to people who we perceive as being, say, below us in some sense. So when we, say, compare ourselves to other people, we will tend to do so, again, when we're uncertain about our own abilities or our own opinions. So if I'm a new professor, I'm not. I've been around for a long time. But if I were a brand new professor and I wanted to, know how I was doing, I would likely look to other professors, maybe other professors in my area in psychology. If I were to engage in upward social comparison, I would be comparing myself to the tenured faculty, the more senior faculty, and I probably would feel some self-consciousness or some inadequacies in my ability. Or I can compare myself to, say, other new faculty members, new professors, who I might have a lower opinion about, or who I've heard some bad things about their teaching or what have you. And in that case, I would be engaging in downward social comparison. And I might feel better about my own abilities by judging or comparing myself to people who I thought were beneath me somehow. Okay, so influences of other people, social comparison, definitely something that we engage in when we're uncertain about our own abilities or thoughts. This idea of the two-factor theory of emotion actually more related to the concept of self-perception or self-perception theory. But the two-factor theory of emotion states that the experience of emotion, how we feel, is based on two things, right? One is the experience of symptoms of the physiological arousal, and the second step of that emotion, of feeling that emotion, is some cognitive interpretation that explains the source of that arousal. So the two-factor theory of emotion kind of goes against, let's say, common sense, or what we would typically think is the cause of emotion. We would think that we experience or we have some type of sad thought, and that causes us to cry. But the two-factor theory of emotion says no. You actually have the physical arousal first, and then your brain has to explain why we're having that physical arousal. So you actually feel the symptoms of sadness before you actually recognize that you're feeling sad. And of course, this happens very quickly. It's not something that we have to sit there and think about for a long time. But it can lead us to, let's say, make mistakes in terms of understanding our emotions. So think about the physiological responses that come with different emotions. So even something like crying, right? So we cry when we're sad, but we also cry when we're happy. We also cry when we're really angry, right? And frustrated. So crying is even something that can be associated with several emotions. So you might, feel some tears coming or feel yourself choking up, and then your brain has to say, okay, wait, are we happy? Are we sad? Are we scared? Are we angry? What's going on here, right? So according to the two-factor theory, we experience the physiological change first, then we have to give it a cognitive label. So other people's reactions will sometimes help us interpret our own arousal, if they were present when that arousal began. In other words, if we're not sure how we should feel, or should we be scared about the situation? Is this an uneasy situation? We might actually look to other people to see how they are responding. So if you've ever been on an airplane that has had some really bad turbulence, you might look to see how other people are reacting. Do they look nervous? Should I be nervous? The people on the airplane that you should be looking at is not the other passengers. It's actually the flight attendants, right? So if the flight attendants look nervous or uneasy, then you're justified in feeling uneasy as well, right? But sometimes we will do this. We will look at how other people are responding, not just in their behaviors, but should we feel sad about this? Should we feel happy about this? How are other people reacting, right? So people can influence us in several different ways. Another source of the self-concept is autobiographical memories, as I discussed at the beginning of the last chapter. These are incredibly important. These are basically the narrative of who we are. Again, when we see in the movies, at least when people experience amnesia, they don't forget how to speak or read or write or do math or any of that stuff. They remember all those informational type of memories. It's who they are is what disappears. It's those autobiographical memories. So these are very important in shaping the self-concept or who we are. Except that, the memories are notoriously untrustworthy is probably the best word. to describe them. Memories change, and they can be manipulated fairly easily. We'll see a little bit more of that in the next chapter, but if you've taken cognitive psychology, you know how malleable memory can be. So we also have, different things are going to influence our memories in different ways. Something like the recency effect. So we're more likely to remember things that have happened more recently than things that have happened in the past. Why? Well, because memory just tends to fade over time. We also have what's known as the reminiscent bump that happens in older adults. So adults who are getting into their 60s, into their 70s, will also have this resurgence of reminiscent type of memories. Some of it can be pretty profound in the level of detail that these memories can encompass. One study took yearbooks from older individuals, and they blacked out the names of the people in their high school yearbooks, and asked these people if they could go back and identify these photos, these pictures of all the classmates in the yearbook from, 50 years ago. And it's pretty shocking in terms of how much how accurate people were in identifying their classmates all those years later. So we tend to have this reminiscent bump later on in life. We're also much more likely to remember what are known as transitional firsts. So your first kiss, the first time you flew on an airplane, when you lost your virginity, the first time you stepped foot on college campus, your first marriage, assuming you're like most people, that you likely will have more than one in your lifetime. All of these firsts that happened in our lives, we tend to have more vivid memories of these types of events. We also have what are known as flashbulb memories. This is different than the concept of a quote-unquote photographic memory, which there really is no evidence that, no compelling or conclusive evidence that, the idea of a photographic memory exists, but flashbulb memories are certainly a thing. And flashbulb memories tend to be extremely vivid memories that happen or surround highly emotionally charged types of events. So for, say, my parents' generation, it was, where were you when you learned that John F. Kennedy was assassinated? For people my age, it was 9/11, right? I remember the craziest details about that day. I was in Queens heading into Manhattan for class when that happened, and I remember so much about it, everything about that day. So things like that, and they don't even need to be traumatic type of events. Just highly emotional. Maybe your wedding, or the birth of your child, something along those lines. So another issue, besides memories fading and being easily manipulated by outside factors, is that we also have a tendency to distort the past in ways that kind of inflate our personal sense of importance and achievement. So we tend to remember things in a way that kind of maybe make us look or feel better, but maybe are not 100% accurate. So there's some downsides to autobiographical memories as being a source of of the self-concept. And then we have our culture, the culture that we grow up in, right, that we're raised in. So the self-concept is definitely influenced by cultural factors. American parents try to raise their children to be independent and self-reliant and assertive, and parents in more Eastern cultures or collectivist type of cultures, in this example here, Japan, we see Japanese children are raised to fit into their peer group and fit into their community. So they're raised to be less independent, or less self-reliant, and to be more group or more community-based. So typically when we speak of culture and cultural differences, in this class anyway, we'll likely take a look at research findings as they relate to individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. So individualist cultures tend to emphasize independence and autonomy, self-reliance. In these cultures, personal gains are more important than your group connections. So in the United States and most Western countries, Western quote-unquote countries, will be more individualistic in nature. Collectivist cultures tend to emphasize interdependence and cooperation and social harmony. And in this case, group affiliation is of the highest priority. So, your allegiance to your family and to your friends and how you fit into the community is going to be much more important in collectivist cultures than in individualistic cultures. Okay, so let's take a look at a little more detail in terms of the cultural influences on the self. So, as I said, in quote-unquote Western countries, this typically means North America and Western European countries, we have this independent view of the self, the view of the self as distinct and autonomous, and endowed with these unique personality traits or dispositions. And we tend to describe ourselves in terms of these personality traits. We'll use, I a lot, right? And like, I do this, or I am that, so on and so forth. So we also tend to see ourselves as more unique and less similar to other people. And we are goal-oriented. We strive for personal achievement, rather than, say, group achievement or even societal achievement. It's kind of hard to get social programs passed in our government, because people tend to be more concerned with themselves than their own progress and their own well-being, let's say. So we differentiate opposites as distinct and separate, which makes it difficult to believe that opposites can coexist within the same person. In other words, we're less tolerant of, say, holding opposing views or holding opposing emotions. We would be quick to call someone out as a hypocrite, let's say, or more quick to call someone out as a hypocrite if they hold two conflicting views. Whereas in more Eastern or collectivist types of cultures, that's perfectly acceptable. It's normal to do, right? So more collectivist cultures we see in Asia, Africa, Latin America, there tends to be an interdependent view of the self. So your self-concept is intertwined with the people who are in your life. So the people in your family, the people who are in your community, in your church, and so on and so forth, right? So people will tend to view themselves as being part of a larger network of social connections. So there's less of an emphasis on the individual or this uniqueness, and they'll tend to describe themselves less in terms of these personal dispositions and more in terms of their group affiliations. They see themselves as being more similar to others, and they derive satisfaction from the status of their groups, of the groups that they belong to. So when their group succeeds, they succeed. They feel a personal sense of accomplishment, more so than, say, people in Western cultures. And of course, there's always going to be individual differences and exceptions to the rules. This is just what the research suggests are generalities here. And as we said before, people in more collectivist types of cultures tend to be more accepting that what might be thought of as opposite views, opposite beliefs, feelings, so on and so forth, that those things can exist within a single person. And that's the concept known as dialectism. So just to try to visualize, say cultural conceptions of self and independent view of the self, more Western type of view, would see the self concept as being separate from our friends, our co-workers, our family, so on and so forth. All of those people are close to us, and they certainly affect us and influence the self, but we see ourselves as being separate from them. In more collectivist societies, they'll have an interdependent view of the self. So friends, co-workers, siblings, so on and so forth, actually are part of your self concept. The way you define yourself will include these people who are part of your life. Okay. We also see that if you think of social classes, it's more of a societal factor rather than a cultural factor, but it's related to this idea of culture, right? We see that social class can also influence our conception of the self, our self-concept. So social class is used to categorize people within a culture who have a common low, working, middle, or upper class socioeconomic status. And we often see almost like subcultures that kind of develop within some of these working classes or within these social classes. In Western countries, higher income, education, and status typically provides more opportunities to exhibit individualism, right? So individualism tends to be a luxury or a privilege that is associated with, say, higher or less poverty, higher education, higher social status. So people who might be, let's say, lower in terms of wealth, might be lower in terms of their educational achievements or status, might actually need to depend on their group. They might actually have, let's say, a symbiotic, mutually beneficial type of relationship with the people that are in their lives. So we tend to see individualism more in wealthier countries, and countries that are still on their way up tend to exhibit these collectivist types of approaches. Okay, so how is that related to self-esteem? Well, let's first talk about what self-esteem is. This is the evaluative component of ourself, right? This is what we think, or more accurately, how we feel about ourselves, right? So we could feel positive about ourselves or negative about ourselves, and anything in between. So self-esteem is made up of many self-schemas, some of which may be viewed as more or less favorably than others. But when it comes to culture, individualistic cultures, we're going to derive our self-esteem from our own personal accomplishments, and our own failures, right, are going to hurt us more. In collectivist cultures, self-esteem is much more intertwined with the groups that you belong to. So you get a higher level of self-esteem when your groups succeed. And, conversely, if your groups are struggling, you'll feel that personally as well. So tying it into, say, those cultural connectedness there. Interestingly enough, I thought, this I think came out of your book, that you would find it interesting. This is a diagram or a chart from one study on level of self-esteem in college students. So the first week looks like college students are feeling pretty good about themselves, but by the end of the first semester, their self-esteem tends to take a pretty big hit there, right? This is likely due to what's known as the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome is something almost every one of us has felt or will feel at some point in our lives. It's basically when we are saying, oh, wow, I don't belong here, right? I feel like a phony. They're going to figure me out. They're going to know that I'm not smart enough to be here, right? So that's something that's natural, something that we all go through. And you see that by the end of the second semester, the end of the first year, self-esteem is back up. So it's usually that first semester. Could be imposter syndrome going on, like I said, but some of it might actually be some kind of adjust. It might take some time to adjust to, being away from family, living on your own, and realizing like, wow, I don't know how to cook for myself. I don't know how to do my own laundry. I don't know how to do all of these things. But then you learn pretty quickly. You have to, right? You don't have a choice. So self-esteem seems to kick back up. It looks like by year 3, little dip. I'm not sure, if that's statistically significant. Maybe if it were a large enough sample of students, but doesn't seem to be all that meaningful of a dip. But it might make sense, like your last year before graduation, you might start worrying a little bit. Okay, like what happens when I make it out into the real world, right? This might be, kind of like a little mini early midlife or early life crisis there. But by year 4, most college students are feeling, again, we're talking about in general here, feeling better, feeling good about themselves. They've accomplished something pretty significant. They've completed a college degree, and kind of from there on out, the world is up for grabs, essentially, right? So, when it comes to the need for self-esteem, humans need self-esteem. We need to feel good about ourselves. The results, or let's say the consequences of not feeling good about yourself, the consequences of low self-esteem are pretty numerous and pretty intense. So humans are just inherently social creatures. We look towards others for approval, and part of this is likely a primitive need. It likely evolved from evolutionary factors. That take a look at us as animals, right? We're not particularly strong. Compared to an ant. An ant can lift 300 times its weight. We're not particularly strong. We're not particularly fast. Paper can make us bleed, right? Paper can cut us. We don't have thick hides or skin. We don't have, these claws or any of this stuff. We're pretty delicate there. What kept us going was our intellect and our cooperation within our group, right? And our evolutionary past, we probably lived in groups around 60 to 100 people-ish. And good luck to you if you got disowned by that group. Good luck outrunning a lion or trying to fight off a bear. You didn't really have much luck. So probably just through evolutionary forces, that any type of uncooperativeness was killed off, right? It was just selected out of our gene pool. Now, one important thing that I said that I will emphasize here is cooperation within our group, right? That's the key there. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, it would make sense that if we have this group going on and we're all cooperating and we're all protecting each other, and we're also, we're all hooking up with each other, so we're all passing on the genes there, it would make sense to cooperate within that group. But if some other group of humans came along, it would make sense for us to be inherently distrustful of that group, because who knows, they might come and try to kill us or come and try to take our resources. That's not us, right? That's not my group. That's them. We are us. So this need for self-esteem comes from the approval of people who we care about or people who are within our in-groups. But this notion of us versus them, in-group versus out-group, is going to be something that comes up quite a bit in this class. So there's an introduction to it. Another way to look at the need for self-esteem, along with feeling that you belong and that you are contributing to your in-groups and that you're accepted by your in-groups, is proposed by the terror management theory. And terror management theory is a pretty interesting theory here. And take a look at some of the research. The way that these studies are done are pretty, if you have a morbid curiosity, I think you would find this interesting. But terror management theory essentially says that, as humans, we are programmed to try to stay alive, right? It's within our best interest to stay alive as long as possible. However, we develop these brains here that we know that we're going to die. And the thought of, or this knowledge that, none of us are going to make it out of here alive, that, our day will come, causes such intense panic and such intense dread that it's described as terror, right? That's the terror in terror management theory, is knowing that we will die. Because literally every cell in our body is is trying to avoid death, and we know it's unavoidable. So terror management theory says if we were to just think about this all the time, we would just live in utter terror, and we would have no life. We would just be consumed by it. So instead, we create what are essentially distractions. We create culture. We create religion. We create political parties. We create these things that distract us from this terror, but that also make us feel good and feel good about ourselves, right? So, again, tying into this need for self-esteem, we might take pleasure, or we might gain pleasure, or gain comfort from attending a religious service, or from voting for our candidate, or campaigning for our candidate. Just being part of groups, just being accepted by groups will make us feel better and distract us from the inevitable there. Okay, so I said before that self-esteem is, can have significant consequences, not just psychological, but, physical consequences as well. So people who have positive self-images, higher self-esteem, tend to be happier, tend to be healthier, tend to be more productive and more successful. And of course, all of those are subjective measures, right? Or subjective concepts. But compared to people who have, say, negative self-images or negative self-esteem, people with negative self-images tend to be more depressed and more pessimistic about the future, and will tend to be more prone to failure, and tend to be less healthy in general. So self-esteem is important for mental and physical health. When it comes to differences in self-esteem, age, we'll see, can affect self-esteem in the sense that we tend to stop caring, or we tend to make less social comparisons as we get older. But two differences that are seen in the research involve gender and race. When it comes to gender differences in self-esteem, they tend to be pretty small. So any gender differences that do exist tend to be, they're significant statistically because they're, done with thousands and thousands of participants, but they're not necessarily all that meaningful. But these differences are tied to specific aspects or different aspects of self-esteem. So men will tend to have higher esteem with regard to their physical appearance and their athletic abilities. However, there's some research to suggest that the higher esteem in regard to the physical appearance is actually changing. We're seeing more pressure on men to adopt these unrealistic beauty standards and body standards that women have been expected to adopt since who knows when, right? Whenever all this shit was made up, essentially. So women tend to have higher self-esteem in matters of ethics and personal morality. Overall, blacks and African Americans tend to have higher self-esteem score than whites. Hispanic or Latinas, Asian and Native American minorities all tend to have lower self-esteem scores than whites. So what might might be going on there. Let me see if the next slide, next slide doesn't discuss. So let me discuss briefly. It's mentioned in your textbook. But generally speaking, black folks have kind of recognized that white culture was not made for them, right? They've long been excluded from participating in the dominant culture, which is white culture. So black folks have essentially come up with their own ways to their own standards by which to judge themselves. So if you're used to seeing a certain look on a magazine cover or in a television ad or on TV, and well, yeah, that's clearly not me, right? I'm not represented in any of that stuff. Then those standards are kind of meaningless to you. There's no way you're going to ever reach them, right? So why try? On the other hand, when we take a look at other ethnic minorities, especially minorities who have migrated to the United States and they want to assimilate, right? Black people did not migrate here. They were forcefully brought here as slaves, brought to this country, and then never given an opportunity to assimilate in any way. But that's different for people who come to this country, who migrate here and want to belong, want to fit in, want to quote unquote succeed in this culture. They're still met with those unrealistic standards, and they're at a double disadvantage because they're migrants, right? And we tend to have some degree of fear of the otherness, some ethnophobia, xenophobia in this country, that again might not allow migrants to fully integrate. So you can see how just history and cultural differences might translate to these racial differences when it comes to self-esteem that we see. Now that was a really down and dirty type of explanation there. Your book will go into more detail. Okay, let's do a time check. I'll try to move along quickly here. So in terms of self-esteem and whether we're going to have high or low self-esteem, the self-discrepancy theory is another way to try to evaluate what causes changes in self-esteem. So according to this theory, we have three different selves, right? We have the actual self, who we really are. We have the ought self, so the self that we should be, right? And then the ideal self, the self that we want to be, right? So the actual self involves concepts and traits that describe who we think we actually are. The ought self involves traits that would, enable you to meet your sense of duty, obligation, and responsibility. So these are just who we ought to be. And then the ideal self is composed of traits that describe the person, like I said, that we would like to be, that we want to be, that we strive to be, right? So self-esteem is, according to this theory, self-esteem is lowered by the degree to which the actual self falls short of the ought self and the ideal self, right? So how much discrepancy exists between who we actually are, who we ought to be, and who we want to be, right? The bigger the differences, the lower our self-esteem. So the less differences, or the closer the actual self is to the ought and ideal self, then the higher our self-esteem will be. Now, when it comes to self-esteem, and when it comes to self-awareness, especially, there's something known as the self-awareness trap. And this is related to self-awareness theory that says that self-focused attention leads people to notice those discrepancies between the actual self and the ought self and the ideal self, thereby motivating either an escape from self-awareness or a change in behavior in ways that will reduce that self-discrepancy. In other words, when we become self-aware, another word for that we use in common language is self-conscious, right? Once we start noticing, paying attention to what we're doing, we tend to be our worst critic. So as soon as you start, even if you're talking to somebody, right, you might start noticing, you might get into your head, oh my God, I'm talking and I sound like an idiot, right? And that actually has this type of negative feedback loop effect. Now you're up in your head worrying about making a mistake, so you're going to make a mistake. But we'll get to that in a second here. But when it comes to self-awareness theory, just when we become focused on ourselves, it tends to end badly. We tend to notice the bad things about ourselves, and that's where that idea or that saying I'm feeling self-conscious, what that really means is you're in a heightened state of self-awareness, and by its nature, self-awareness tends to make us focus on the things we're not so happy about ourselves. Now, according to this theory, there's two things you can do about this. You can either try to make your actual self closer to your ought self and your ideal self. You can try to close that gap, to basically shrink that discrepancy, or you can distract yourself. You can try to forget about it, right? You can try to ignore it. Pretend, forget that. Let's pivot. Let's go watch some YouTube videos or something. This is also called, shaping up, which means doing stuff to improve your actual self, to better fit with your ideal and ought self. So shaping up or shipping out, which means, fuck that shit. I'm not going to pay attention to it. I'm not going to care about it. Life is too short, right? Whatever we tell ourselves in that moment, to try to feel better about ourselves. Okay, so when it comes to, we don't have to go through all these just for the sake of time. But when it comes to, say, some characteristics of self-consciousness, items that might measure private self-consciousness. So these are, things or inadequacies that we're going to feel about ourselves, internally. Some things that might measure, how we are privately self-conscious involved. I'm always trying to figure myself out. I'm constantly examining my motives. Often the subject of my own fantasies. I'm alert to changes in my mood, so on and so forth. These are things that are trying to measure how self-aware or self-focused you are about your internal processes. But we also have a public self that we can be conscious about or aware about, right? There's who we are on the inside, and then there's who we show people publicly. So items that might measure public self-consciousness include: I'm concerned about what other people think of me, self-conscious about the way I look, concerned about the way I present myself, I worry about making a good impression, so on and so forth. Right? So we might be self-conscious about who we are as, say, people on the inside, but also self-conscious about how others perceive us or how we present ourselves. So again, traits of self-consciousness, private self-consciousness, a personality characteristic of individuals who tend to be more introspective. They're often attending to noticing their own inner states. Public self-consciousness is a personality characteristic of individuals who focus on themselves more as social objects, as they are seen by other people. And depending on what we're self-conscious about, whether we're at the moment privately self-aware or publicly self-aware or self-conscious, that will influence the ways in which we try to reduce these self-discrepancies. So it depends. Are we publicly or privately self-conscious? This is the difference between shame and embarrassment. So shame is something that we feel bad about, something that we are not proud of ourselves for doing. But embarrassment requires someone else to notice, right? So shame is internal, embarrassment is external. Things that we do in the privacy of our own living quarters, that we wouldn't feel shameful about. If somebody saw us do it, we might feel embarrassed about it, right? Because of that external or social component there. Okay, so related to this, particularly related to public self-awareness or self-consciousness, is the notion of self-regulation. So essentially, how do we regulate our behaviors? So self-regulation, the process by which people control their thoughts, their feelings, or their behaviors in order to achieve a personal or social goal. There is such a thing as self-regulation fatigue, and this suggests that we only have a certain amount of capacity, a certain amount of energy that can be designated or that can be used for self-regulation. So it's a cognitively intense process. It takes up a lot of resources. It will exhaust us, essentially. So when it comes to, let's say, self-regulation, there are some psychological factors that can kind of counteract the fatigue that comes to self-regulation. One of them is positive mood. So, and we probably all have experienced this at some point. When we're happier, we tend to, have more energy to, just more energy in general, right? But more energy to kind of control our thoughts or to regulate our behaviors. When we're depressed or we feel like crap, we're sapped of energy, and maybe we'll wear the same clothes a few days in a row or something. We're really less concerned about regulating our behaviors or putting on a show for other people. Why? Well, we're depressed, right? We're in a bad mood, but we just don't have the energy to spend on this type of self-regulation. So that goes for your thoughts and your feelings, but also how we present ourselves to other people. So when it comes to self-regulation and when it comes to self-awareness, self-consciousness, I hinted at or spoke a little bit about these types of ironic mental processes that can come up. One of these ironic mental processes is what we call choking, right? And we've all, done this. We're all, familiar with this, I'm sure. And we probably, even this term, you said, oh, I'm choking up here, right? I'm totally messing up. So when we talk about choking, this is a paradigm paradoxical type of failure that's caused by trying too hard and thinking too much. So when we, well, good example, erectile dysfunction. Most of the time, especially for younger guys, it's a psychological issue. Most likely choking, right? That they're thinking too hard. You're so afraid of it happening that you're actually going to cause it to happen. And when you first start, say, public speaking, it's a good one, a more universal one that everyone can, relate to. If you were giving a speech, even sometimes now, when I speak for a living and clearly have no problem going on and on, even sometimes now, if I start thinking about what I'm saying, then I'm like, what the hell? What's happening? Like, then I'm like, I can start stammering, right? I could start like losing it. I could start like choking, because I'm too up in my head. I was like, okay, wait, what am I saying? This sounds stupid. So this is certainly, something that we all experience. And it's a result of being too self-aware, being too, self-conscious. Ironic processes in general. Again, this is the harder it is for you to, or the harder you try to inhibit a thought, a feeling, or behavior, the less likely you are to succeed at that. So an example of this would be, whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant right now. Just right now, don't think of a pink elephant. It's impossible. You just thought of it, right? So this is an example of an ironic process. We see this, if you've ever seen Austin Powers, or, I might be dating myself. That was the 90s, I think, or early 2000s. Austin Powers, there was somebody who had a big mole on their face, and he was told, this person you meet, they're going to have a big mole on their face. Just don't pay attention to it. Don't say anything about it, right? Okay, well, great. Now he has to say something, right? So this whole conversation Austin Powers is having with this person, he's trying so hard not to say something about the mole on the person's face, and he just comes out and says, mole, right? I should probably find a clip for that for the next time I do this lecture. It's a great example of an ironic process. So our brains are our worst enemy sometimes there. Okay, so moving along here. Relating to how we present ourselves to other people, there are essentially two different routes that we can take. One is say self enhancement, and the other is self verification. But self enhancement is doesn't have to relate to just how we present ourselves. It could also relate to attempts for us to try to reduce that discrepancy that's related to self-esteem between our actual self and our ideal self, or our ought self. So self-awareness can lower self-esteem by focusing attention on these discrepancies. We discussed this already, right? When we become self-aware, when we become self-focused, self-conscious, it typically is not good for us. It results in a drop in self-esteem. So we can try to avoid focusing on ourselves and maybe focus on other people instead, or focus on some other task. We know that efforts at self-regulation often fail and backfire. So sometimes the harder we try to not say something, or not do something, or even not feel something, the more likely we are to do that thing or feel that thing or say that thing or think that thing, right? So we have those ironic mental processes that go on there. How then does the average person cope with their own faults, inadequacies, and an uncertain future? Well, we have a couple tricks up our sleeves. Our brains have, evolved to help us cope with these negative feelings. The first is known as the better than average effect, and this is where, instead of comparing ourselves to, let's say, individual people who may be more successful or have more of their shit together than we do, instead we'll kind of just get an average of the group that we belong to, let's say. So instead of you comparing yourself to some other college student or even the students in this class, you might just say, well, I'm doing better than most college students or the average college student, right? So I can be a pretty bad husband and be totally inattentive and all that stuff, but I'm still better than average. And that's kind of a way to make me feel better about myself. Whether it's true or not, who the hell knows? It's my idea of average. That's the key there. We also have implicit egoism. And implicit egotism is when we tend to associate ourselves with things that remind us of ourselves or things that we feel connected to in some way. A silly example would be, but it's actually true. This is, you can find this, check it out if you don't believe me, but you'll find more people with the last name Jones living in a place called Jonestown, right? Than you would in any other type of city. People who, just trying to think of other types of examples like this, but people will tend to be attracted to things that kind of reflect on themselves or remind them of themselves. So this is that type of, they're not doing it consciously. They're just are attracted to it because it's, it reminds them of them, right? We also have self-serving beliefs. Self-serving beliefs are when we take credit for the good things that happen to us, and we blame other people for the bad things that happen. So we have an exam coming up not too long from now, and if you do well on that exam, I'm sure you're going to feel really good about yourself. It's because you worked hard, you listened to these lectures, you attended classes, you studied. If you fail that exam, it's probably going to be my fault, right? Because you're going to say, well, his lectures are too long, or he didn't explain this, or those questions were too tricky, or whatever the case may be. But if you do well, you're not going to give me credit for being a great, awesome professor. You're going to give yourself the credit. But if you bomb it or do not as good as you were hoping, I'm going to bet you it's my fault, no matter what. That's how self-serving beliefs work. We also have what's known as self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is when we actually sabotage. It's also known as self-sabotage. We kind of set ourselves up to fail. So let's say you are not feeling this exam coming up, right? And or you have a really good feeling that, yeah, I'm not getting this material. I don't know if I'm stupid. I don't know if I need to pick a new major. I don't know what's going on. And again, this is implicit. This is stuff, you're not actually saying this stuff, but you may be thinking some of this. And then instead of studying for the exam, the day before it's due, you're going to go out and party and, get really drunk and really hungover and have zero time to study and have a pounding headache. And then you're going to take the exam and then you're going to fail the exam. But what did you do? Well, you actually protected your self-esteem, because now you can say that you failed the test because you were drunk or hungover and had a horrible headache and couldn't study, not because you have low intelligence, or because you think you're lazy, or because whatever negative type of feelings you might have had. You actually spared yourself from those feelings, because now you get to blame the low exam grade on getting drunk, having a bad hangover, right? That's an example of self-handicapping. Basking in reflected glory. When's the Super Bowl? I think that's coming up, right? It's going to be a whole lot of people basking in reflected glory. I'm not a sports fan, not a big sports fan, but it's always fascinating to me, like how intense people get about sporting events. So like when their team that they're rooting for scores a goal or something, they're like, yeah, woo. They're like, relax, dude. You didn't do anything. you're there drinking beer, eating Fritos. You didn't do shit. What are you getting all excited about? And then they start like dissing on, their friends who are rooting for the other team. Like, you guys suck. And be like, you guys, wait, since when did you become part of that? Since when did you join the league? Like, so this is a classic example of basking in other people's glory. Your parents do it anytime you are successful in anything, right? They take pride in what you're doing, but it's also a reflection on them, right? They get to they get to tell people, look at what my daughter or my son or my child is doing, right? What they're really saying is, look at what an awesome parent I am, right? They don't have to take these exams. They don't have to sit through this stuff, but they still get to bask in your glory, essentially. And then finally, downward social comparison, which we spoke about already. Downward social comparison is a great, easy and effective way, not great, but easy and effective way to make yourself feel better without actually having to do something. You could say, yeah, well, I totally failed this exam, but, the person sitting next to me, I got a 60, they got a 40 on their exam, so at least I'm not as bad as that, right? You might be in a shitty job, in college, just to have some extra spending money, and you might say, wow, this job really, really sucked. But at least I'm not doing that, right? Like, there's still people worse off than I am. So that's a way that we can make ourselves feel better. By basically, comparing ourselves to people who have it worse than we do. Okay, so when it comes to, again, self-presentation, the way that we present ourselves to other people, we tend to think that people are paying attention to us way more than people are actually paying attention to us. This is known as the spotlight effect. So this is our tendency to believe that the social spotlight is shining on us at all times, and it's really not. So, when we have a pimple or a cold sore or something, we are constantly aware of it, and we think everyone else is as well, right? We think everyone else is just staring at that thing. Or if we're giving a talk and we mess up, we're like, oh my god, I can't believe I did that, how embarrassing. Chances are nobody even noticed. Or if they noticed, nobody cares, right? But we think it does. We think this is the worst thing in the world. So we care very much typically what other people think about us. And again, there's different strategies that we can use to try to present ourselves to other people. So when we talk about strategic self-presentation, these are efforts to shape others' impressions in specific ways in order to gain influence, power, sympathy, or just people's approval. One tactic is ingratiation, trying to get yourself into that group, get yourself into that group and accepted by that group. Excuse me. The next is self-promotion, essentially trying to sell yourself, right? Trying to play up your qualities. If you're going for a job interview, this would be very common to engage in this type of self-presentation. You want to put your best foot forward, right? You want to make a really great first impression. You want to get that job. You want to win over people's approval. Maybe once you have that job, you might want to act in a certain way that shows that you command respect and power and so on and so forth. So this idea of self-promotion is something we will engage in from time to time. There's also the okay, so just for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip over this, but you could go ahead and read some of these. It'll tell you different concepts and questions that we might ask ourselves depending on what kind of strategy that we're trying to take there. Aside from self-promotion, the other tactic that you can use in terms of presenting yourself is self-verification. So self-verification is the desire to have other people perceive you as you truly are. So people will selectively elicit, recall, and accept personality feedback that confirms their own self-conceptions, what we already think of ourselves, even if that self-concept is negative. So if we don't think very highly of ourselves, we might not want other people to think very highly of us either, because we want people to think of us in the same way we think of ourselves. So self-verification is not always a good thing, right? It's about being authentic to who you are, or who you think you are, and sometimes we don't think a lot of ourselves, unfortunately. But the desire for self-verification appears in both individualistic and in collectivist cultures. And we'll see in a second. Some people might be, more geared towards self-verification. Others might be more geared towards self-presentation. And one of the determining factors is whether you are a high self-monitor or a low self-monitor. So when we talk about self-monitoring, this is when we regulate our behavior to meet the demands of a social situation. So people who are high in self-monitoring appear to have a repertoire of selves from which they can draw. They have a number of tools at their disposal. That a given situation comes, they can flip into gear, right? They're constantly monitoring the situation, monitoring the demands and the needs of the situation, and then they're able to adjust their behaviors accordingly. They see themselves as pragmatic, as being adaptable, being able to adjust pretty easily. People who our low self-monitors tend to be more about self-verification. So they tend to be less concerned with presenting themselves in a positive light, per se, and more concerned about people knowing who they are and recognizing them for who they are. People who are low self-monitors will tend to see themselves as maybe more principled and more forthright. Now, again, this is social psychology, so you're not necessarily one or the other. It's going to depend on the situation. I'll give you an example. When I was applying to graduate schools, I was definitely more of a self-promoter, right? These were really competitive programs, PhD programs, really tough to get into. So I totally, got a haircut, bought a suit, I did all that shit. I did all of it, right? Total in self-promotion mode. When I took this job, though, it was a different story. I was coming from Brooklyn, and I was applying to a whole bunch of jobs, across the country. And I applied to this job at Oneana, and with these academic jobs, you apply, and then it's months before you hear anything. I'm just chilling in Brooklyn, down by Coney Island. I lived in Brighton Beach, Coney Island area, and then the phone rings, and it was like voice caller ID, and they're like, whatever the number was, and they said Wananta, New York. Wananta, New York. And I'm like, where the hell is Wananta, New York? Where is this place? So I picked up the phone, and they're like, okay, so we're interested. Are you still interested in the job? Do you want to do a phone interview and stuff? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I go online and I check out, what this place is. I don't remember even applying to this job. And then I look at where it is. It's like upstate New York, and I'm kind of like, I grew up on Long Island. I lived that time over a decade in New York City. I'm like, I don't know about this place. And then I'll just wrap this up really quickly. So then when I came up for the job, I did, wear a suit, and I didn't get a haircut, but I at least cleaned it up a bit. But I took a bus from the Port Authority, and it was a bus that went up to Albany. I had like a 3-hour wait over time, and then a bus down I-88. And I'm the only one on the bus, and it's just nothing but darkness on either side of me for, what's that, like an hour and 20-minute, hour and a half drive. And if you ever seen the movie Fargo, you know what I'm talking about. That scene, right? I'm in the middle of nothing. This is bumblefuck USA, right? So I said, if I'm moving up here and this is it for me, right? This is going to be, I'm going to be tenured here. I'm going to make my career here. They need to know what they're getting. So I totally went full self-verification mode. I was just me. I talked the way that I talk. I made, inappropriate jokes. I threw in, F-bombs in there a few times, I'm sure. Because this was it, right? I couldn't pretend to be something I'm not. Because I'm not I can't move up here and fake the funk for that long. If this were going to be my life, then it had to be real. And apparently it worked out, because I'm here 10 years later. So the take-home message is, don't get me on one of these spiels, because I could go on forever. But more importantly, the self is really complicated. Our self-concept is really complicated, and it changes depending on the situation. There are lots of factors that go into making up our self-concept, and other people have a tremendous influence on us, for better or worse, because not everyone are good people, right? And people hurt us, and people can hurt our self-concept. It's the nature of the beast, though, right? We're social creatures. So, so much to the point where, people who don't feel a need to affiliate, people who don't really like other people, we diagnose them as being schizoid, right? Or as being even sociopathic or psychopathic. We think there's something wrong with people who hate other people, right? That's how important other people are to us. So there's lots of different facets to the self, and a closing question to ponder are, what are some of the facets of yourself? But you might not want to think about that too much, right? Because again, what we learned from this chapter, what happens when you think about yourself too much? It's usually bad stuff is what comes up. That's why I say everybody should be in therapy. It's just because it's our nature. Whenever we try to deal with something ourselves that's related to us, we tend to just make it worse. Okay, on that note, I'm done. This is part 2, which a little longer than the first one, but still, this is 3 hours worth of lecture. This is what you would get if we were meeting in person. Even my stupid jokes and my rants and all that stuff. So, giving you the real experience here. All right, everyone. Enjoy the weekend, and I look forward to our second class meeting coming up soon. Take care.